Hi, everyone. Welcome to the lecture on the Book of Numbers, titled The Blessing. So we continue our look at the first 5 books, the Pentateuch, and we find ourselves pretty much in the same place that we left in Exodus. We are still encamped with the Israelites at the base of Mount Sinai as God forms them into a people, gives them rules, laws, this sacrificial system, these priests to serve as intermediaries, and then prepares them to move on into this promised land that God is giving to them. And so let's look at this slide. It's a little more helpful. So here we are. It's about a year where they are at Mount Sinai after Moses leads them out of Egypt. And then in Numbers 10, they finally make the beginning of their journey to the promised land. And what should have been a relatively short journey, a few months or so, turns out to take 40 years because the Israelites show themselves to be pretty unfaithful and don't believe God, and instead look to what their own eyes can see, and God punishes them because of it. So Numbers, like the other books of the Pentateuch written by Moses, with contribution from others, and certainly an editorial process of putting the pieces of the story together, the different lists, the census records, things that Moses told them, probably accounts from other people, and kind of merging it together to make a cohesive book. So probably put into final written form sometime during the time of the kings. The genres, we've got multiple as we have in the other books of the Pentateuch. There's lists, there's census, there's narrative, historiography, all combined to, again, make one cohesive whole. And the book is really centered around 3 main geographical locations, the first being Sinai, then Kadesh. This is the wilderness. This is where they spend time wandering, and things go awry here. The spies bring back the bad report. The people listen to the spies rather than God. And because of that, they face God's judgment. And he says, 20 people over 20, you are actually not going to get to enter into the promised land. And then we finally have them sort of centered in Moab, just on the border of the land of Canaan, the promised land. And here they make preparations again to enter the land. And we see the stories of Balaam and Balak, the apostasy at Peor, and the plagues that result from that, and Joshua tapped to succeed Moses. And here is a map of some of these wanderings. You can see that they are the red arrow here, coming down to Mount Sinai. Then up around here is the wilderness that they're wandering in. And then finally, they're going to end up about here. This is Mount Nebo, where Moses dies. And here is just another map showing you the same, but identifying points in the story, like water from the rock, the manna, judgment here, and then finally up here, and they will enter into the land at Jericho. That comes next week. So the structure of Numbers, chapters 1 through 9, we're dealing with preparation. The census is taken. They're organizing themselves, preparing to leave Mount Sinai and head to the promised land. Chapters 10 through 25 encompass the journey, and it leads to wandering because of their rebellion and complaints. And this is in the wilderness. And then the last 10 chapters are sort of take 2. A new census is taken. They reorganize themselves. They're on the plains of Moab, and they're preparing to enter into the promised land. A word about the numbers of Numbers and just numbers in general, especially in the Old Testament. It's really hard to make a one-for-one literal correlation because often the numbers just don't quite seem to match up to our modern day understanding of numbers. So for instance, if we were to interpret the census in Numbers literally, the numbers themselves seem too large for what archaeological evidence suggests. I talked about this in the lecture on Exodus, but it seems like it wasn't this mass migration of like 1 million, 2 million people all at once, leaving Egypt, going through the wilderness, and entering Canaan all together. It seems like it was a little bit gentler of a migration, pockets of people, And certainly, I think once we get to the book of Joshua and the actual entrance into the land, we're going to see that. I do think they're together as they are in the wilderness. That makes sense. There was land there and space, and clearly God's providing the food for them, as we are told in the Bible. But once they get to Joshua, we're going to see that infiltration into the land is not this giant group moving through the land of Canaan all at once. But regardless, it just seems like these numbers are too large. Another option is that the word that's translated thousands, it might actually mean tribes or chieftains. But the rebuttal to that is, well, why use such big numbers? Why not just say tribes or chieftains? The census list, this is another scholar writing, the census list represents an ancient tradition of tribal quotas of men available for war, so that the terms in question signify military units of some kind. Another suggestion is that perhaps some kind of numerology is at work. Whatever the case, there's not a lot of consensus here among scholars. It just seems that these numbers are symbolic and stylized, and that potentially are too large. So there's some kind of symbolism at work here. We're just not quite sure what it is. The tribes are arranged in camps, and there was a certain way that this happened that they detail in Numbers. And so here is a picture of what that looks like. You can see in the center, we've got the tabernacle and the court where they would offer their sacrifices. Around the tabernacle, down here is a little easier to see, are the Levites divided into their groupings. They each have a different role to play in the movement of the tabernacle. Each one is assigned different pieces and components to move. And then, of course, Moses, Aaron, and the priests oversee the sacrifices. And then around this, we've got the other Israelite camps. And then outside of this arrangement would have been considered, just outside. And then way off here would have been the wilderness itself. So theology and numbers, we've got God's presence, God's providence, and God's patience. God is continually with the people. He's operating in a leadership role. They don't have a king. God is their king. It's really a theocracy at this point. He's providing for the people's needs in often supernatural ways. And we see his patience. Yes, they still get punished for some of the things that they do, but God doesn't wipe them out altogether. God extends mercy and grace, often because of the intercession or through the intercession of Moses. But we see that God remains the God of these people who so far have not shown very much faith to God, despite everything that they've seen happen. This is the generation that God brought out of Egypt, and how quickly they turn and grumble and complain and lack in trust. And the question in Numbers that we also saw in Leviticus, how can these sinful people, these ordinary people are sinful, have fellowship with a holy God? How can we possibly, these people possibly sustain God's presence living amongst them and do so safely? So there's kind of three things at work. They need to be pure. So they have these procedures and process of cleanliness, which we talked about in Leviticus. They need to be obedient. They need to adhere to God's laws. God gave them the laws for a reason, to set them apart as God's people, to enable them to have God living amongst them, and to enable them to truly serve as God's voices, God's hands and feet, bringing people to a greater knowledge of God. And finally, we have intercession, and this is really important. We've seen this from the beginning as well. The priesthood, it operates as the intercessors, the intermediaries between God and the people, and the sacrificial system offers a means of restoring the people into community with each other and with God. And finally, we see the theology that God is the God of everybody, not just Israel. And this has been true all along. And sometimes we can lose sight of that because we're seeing this story unfold through the perspective of Israel. So for instance, once they get out of Egypt, we sort of lose Egypt. Who knows what's going on in Egypt? I mean, we know because of other historical accounts, but the Bible doesn't really talk about them very much anymore. That's because, again, we are getting the story of Israel told by Israelites. God chose to reveal himself in a certain place and time to a certain group of people. And the story is one of relationship. God reveals himself through relationships with human beings. And so there's always going to be perspective involved in that. But God will continually remind both Israel and us that he is God of everybody. Everybody is going to be accountable to God, and we're going to see that as this story continues. And so here in Numbers, we have this crazy, interesting story of the talking donkey and, the desire of a king to curse Israel. And yet every time his representative opens his mouth, all that comes out is blessing. So we see that God is at work in all things and all people, and that God has his eye on everybody, not just Israel. We also find in Numbers the priestly blessing. I love this blessing, and so I just wanted to include it here and read it over you in the midst of this lecture. And it goes like this. The Lord said to Moses, "Tell Aaron and his sons, this is how you are to bless the Israelites. Say to them, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace. So they will put my name on the Israelites, and I will bless them." And it's just interesting to see the context in which that blessing comes. Chapters 5 and 6 really talk about purity and how to keep the camp pure. And at the end of that comes this priestly blessing where God is putting his name on these Israelite people. They are, by extension, representatives of God. This is why they must keep themselves pure. They must be obedient, and they must participate in this intercessory process so that they can maintain that relationship with God. So purity is the safeguard for abiding with God's presence in their midst. If they were to let themselves become impure, it would be like me putting my hand into fire without any kind of protective covering. And so just to recap, a general uncleanliness here that they talk about. They don't talk about everything Leviticus talked about, but they do kind of hit on some issues. My guess is these were things that were happening at the time, and so they were reminding the community of these issues. So there's general uncleanliness, skin issues, discharges, dead body contamination. This is just the stuff of being human. There's nothing sinful about it. It's not that you're bad if you have these things. It's just that they make you unclean, and you need to go through the process of becoming clean again. Then they talk about restitution for wrongs being made. Remember, we looked at the two types of sacrifices for sin. One was for accompanying restitution, where there was some kind of financial or compensatory component to the sacrifice. And then we've got this interesting little story, the test for an unfaithful wife, or a sotah in Hebrew. It's interesting. We can talk more about it in Zoom if you are curious about what is going on here. It's another instance of something that happened in the ancient Near East in other cultures, and it's something that gets reconstituted for the people of God. And then finally, there's an entire chapter here on the Nazarites. We will see this word and term again. Samson, who's one of the judges of Israel, is a Nazarite, and this, at the end of that, is when we get that priestly blessing. Then there is talk of obedience. So we know that the laws are meant to shape Israel's worship. They're meant to offer judgment on disobedience, to teach people right from wrong, and to prepare these people to do what God has intended for them. The laws are actually instruments of God's grace, and sometimes that's hard to wrap our minds around. We might think of them as negative things, but they are instruments of grace to enable the people to live together in community, to live with God in their midst, and to do the work that God has called them to. So Numbers 13 through 14 and Numbers 16 are some chapters where we see obedience at work, or rather lack of obedience. So the story in 13 and 14, the spies scout out the promised land. God has asked Moses to send these spies, but most of them focus on what they can see. They allow fear to lead them into disobedience, and by way of that, the entirety of Israel also becomes afraid and allows fear to cloud their judgment. And the exceptions are Joshua, Caleb, and Moses. But that's it. Everybody else is like, nope, we're done. We don't want to go into this land. And so Moses does here intercede for the people. So we see that importance of the intercessory action. But while God does extend mercy, he doesn't wipe all the people out. Moses' intercession doesn't negate punishment. Sin carries with it consequences and punishment. And here we're going to see that punishment enacted. So he says to the people, anyone over 20 will not enter the land, and you will end up wandering for 40 years. And then in Numbers 16, we have the story of these 3 guys who rebel against Moses. And by rebelling against Moses, they also rebel against God. And they and their families are swallowed up. And this is hard to read about, especially when we consider that the families die as well. Certainly there were innocent children involved in this, and we wonder, why, God, would you visit the punishment upon these innocent children? A couple things going on here. One is that sin doesn't just affect the sinner. It affects people in close proximity. Sometimes it affects strangers. Sin has a ripple effect often and has ramifications that extend beyond the person who has committed the sin. So that's the truth of sin. The other truth of the story is that God has Moses warn them to get away. He says, go away from these people, separate yourselves, and they don't listen. Whether these men refuse to let their family go or the family refuse to leave the sides of the men, they then become participants in the men's sin. And it's unfortunate and it's terrible. And certainly as parents and guardians of these children, they should have at least sent the children away, but they don't. And that's the awfulness of sin, is that it can cloud us so much that we don't even, sometimes people stop caring about the effects that it has, even on the most innocent of people. So the intercession and leadership, we saw it at work in the story of the spies. We see issues of leadership with Moses and Aaron in Numbers 20. This is the explanation for why Moses and Aaron don't get to enter the promised land. And it comes as a bit of a shock, knowing Moses, watching all the things that, reading about, listening to all the things he has done on God's behalf. And all of a sudden it's this one thing, and he's not allowed to enter the land. And we think, why this? Why now? You didn't say anything to Aaron after the golden calf incident. So what is it about this incident? So we know in the story, Moses didn't follow God's instructions for getting water. He lectures the people. He attributes the water to himself. That's never a good thing, to attribute the work of God to one's own hand. And then he strikes the rock with the rod twice when God has said not to do that. This shows us that Moses is great. He is a man who gets to have this relationship with God where he talks to God and is shiny in face because of the interactions he has with God. But Moses is still a man, and he is not perfect. And we certainly know Aaron is not perfect. But they are leaders. By this point, they're considered mature men of faith. They've been through a lot with God. They have taken vows. Aaron has been ordained and consecrated as the high priest, and they are in a position of great leadership. And thus, they are held to a higher standard than other people in the Israelite camp, and a higher standard than what God held them to in the beginning when they were first starting out on this journey from Egypt. They are supposed to intercede for the people, not lead the people astray. And anything that they do at this point threatens to lead the people astray, because as we've seen, these are not people that have strong faith at all. And because of this, they are punished. There is a progression in one's leadership and in one's faith. This is true of people in the Old Testament, New Testament, and of us today. And the more closer we grow to God, the better we should know. We should know better the consequences of turning away from God. And then in Numbers 22 through 24, we've got that story of Balaam and Balak and the talking donkey. This also teaches us something about intercession and leadership. We see that God can and will speak through anyone or anything when necessary to preserve God's people. So God does intervene in human affairs. He allows free will, but when his plan for redemption and restoration is threatened, God will intercede. And so we are called to be intercessors as God's people, but we know that God will not allow a lack of faithfulness to derail his plans either. So in the story, there's, confusion. Balaam doesn't listen to God, and then God does not allow him to be unfaithful, but instead he puts blessings into his mouth. So we are not big enough to mess up God. That's a quote from a Bible study teacher named Beth Moore. She said one time she was nervous about her first teaching for Bible study, and her friend said, "Don't worry, honey, you are not big enough to mess up God." And that's true. There are definitely penalties to pay and blessings to be had for being faithful or unfaithful, but just because someone is unfaithful doesn't mean God is going to let the whole plan be derailed. And then in Numbers 27, we see the final act of Moses' leadership is to pass on his mantle of authority to Joshua. Joshua being one of the two spies who remained faithful, who encouraged everyone to trust God, and he's often featured, standing right there by Moses outside the tent of meeting. So he gets to be the one to take the people into the promised land. All right, that's the end. Let me offer a quick prayer, and then I'm going to move on to the lecture on Deuteronomy next. Gracious God, thank you so much for this word that you've given us, the revelation that we have. Lord, may it be not just about gaining information, but about transformation of faith to grow us in our faith maturity. We love you, Lord, and we pray this in Jesus' name. All right, I'll see you next for the lecture on Deuteronomy.